This is Larry Crumpler and Jayne Aubele, and we're here at the Albuquerque Volcanic Field, also known as the Petroglyph National Monument. And we're going to do a little virtual field trip here. The purpose is not to tell you all about the Albuquerque volcanoes and how they fit into the greater landscape around Albuquerque, how they're formed and their entire history and so on and so forth, but instead to just focus on a few details, a few tools that you could use when, for example, you're out here hiking in the petroglyphs and you really would like to know what you're looking at. And these tools will give you an idea of what you're actually seeing in individual rocks, as well as how they relate to the eruption as a whole. The first tool that you want to keep in mind is that the Albuquerque volcanoes are a fissure eruption. Of course, you've probably seen fissure eruptions in the recent news. In 2018, there was the Lower East Rift Zone eruptions in Hawaii, in which there were fissures or cracks in the ground which opened up through housing development, and magma shot into the air along curtains of fire or fire fountains, and impacted the ground and then flowed away in these beautiful long streams of hot lava in channels that then flowed down the flanks of the volcano. So that's exactly what the Albuquerque volcanoes were doing when they erupted. And in fact, there are other fissure eruptions throughout the world. Iceland's another good example that you sometimes see. There are some on some of the other large oceanic islands, but in continental areas, they're kind of rare. So that's why the Albuquerque volcanoes are kind of a unique resource right here near the Natural History Museum. So next we're going to start just looking at some of these rocks and kind of understanding how they relate to that big picture of the fissure eruption and the lavas flowing across the surface in these channels.
Hey, quick Geology 101. This is basalt. Basalt is a volcanic rock. All volcanic rocks are igneous rocks. The word igneous comes from the Latin word for fire, same root word as ignition, and these are truly rocks born from fire. You can actually think about them as first generation or primary rocks formed directly, crystallized directly from a magma. Now, basalt is a basic type of volcanic rock, and I mean that in the chemical terminology. Very low silica, high sodium, high calcium, high iron, magnesium. It forms very fluid eruptions, and therefore most of the lava flows that you see will be basalt or basaltic. There's a lot of basalt in New Mexico, a lot of basalt all over the earth, and of course on other planets as well. So a lot of people ask, where did all this lava come from? Because they don't recognize the Albuquerque volcanoes as being small, individual, really pristine volcanoes. But yes, all of these flows came from the volcanoes themselves as they were fire fountaining, building themselves up. Some of that material became lava flows that extended out and went downslope toward the valley, toward the river. Now, if you look at the lava flows right in front of us here on the mesa at the side of Rinconada Canyon, there's one really clear lava flow that forms kind of that top ledge, top layer at the very top of the slope of the wall. But look above that. Those ridges and lines that you see of basalt actually depict different flow units. So there's actually probably about at least three different flow units that you can actually pick out on the top of the mesa. These volcanoes erupted a series of flows. The oldest probably went the farthest. The younger ones interacted with the oldest ones and couldn't go quite as far. So basalt can look dull, black, boring. That's because it's weathered at the surface. Most of the weathering is actually, well, some of the weathering is physical, rain, wind, but some of it is chemical. It's called desert varnish, and we'll talk about that and show you a good example in a few minutes. But if you can look underneath the weathered surface, and that's of course why geologists wear and carry hammers, which we don't have, by the way, here in Petroglyph National Monument. But if you can get below the surface, then you can see the constituent minerals of the rock. And of course, for basalt, it's dominantly feldspar, pyroxene, magnetite, a little bit of quartz, a little bit of biotite,
No.
and lots of olivine, which you might know as peridot or peridot, the August birthstone. In fact, it's a very special mineral because olivine only forms at high temperature, high pressure. So it's found primarily in basalts.
But now let's talk about another thing, something that's at a little bit bigger scale. This particular block here is, as you can see, it's bigger than Jayne. It's maybe about 6 or 7 feet across, and it turns out that what you're looking at is the cross section through one of the Albuquerque volcano's lava flows, and it's tilted on its side. Okay, so it actually turns out that the bottom is over here and the top is over on this side. We'll take a quick look at that in a second. And of course, what happened was it was flowing in a channel, and when the channel quit being supplied, it sat there and solidified or froze in place. Then it became just a rock sitting on top of the local landscape. Erosion took place, eroded back the edges of the flow, and it became broken off and moved down the slope. And of course, in that process, it rotated into this position as opposed to its flat-lying position, which it occupied previously up there on the edge of the mesa. So it came down here. And now you can actually go and see what the bottom of the lava flow looked like at the time of the eruption 200,000 years ago. Okay, and here it is. If you look at it closely, and you have to see these in person to really get a good sense of the 3 dimensions, it's a very jagged, very scoriaceous type of surface. Okay, and the very edge of the flow here, where it contacted the surface, is actually kind of very dark. It's almost without detail. It's chilled against the ground that it was flowing over. But anyway, there's the surface on the bottom of the flow. So you're looking at the bottom of the flow that formed 200,000 years ago, and this was in contact with the surface of what then was the landscape here on the west side of Albuquerque. But now if you look a little bit closer, you can see that there are the gas bubbles that are in lava flows. And as you get to the base, there are very few. Remember, it's a chilled zone. Then as we move up the lava flow, which remember is this block is tilted on its side, you get more and more gas bubbles. And they get bigger and bigger and even bigger, and then suddenly they start getting smaller, and then they get really small, and then they keep getting smaller and smaller, although there are more of them. And this is just a fundamental characteristic of lava flows, which when they're cooling, the gases come out of solution. You get these bubbles that form what we call vesicles when it's solidified into the final basalt rock. And the gases come out of solution early, and there's lots of them, and they get chilled as the crust starts forming from the top, which we are now approaching. And so those get trapped early. But then the ones on the inside are free to float around and coalesce and grow, and so those tend to be bigger. So that explains something you'll see in each block, that you can find this complete cross section. Now let's go all the way up to the top of the lava flow, which is perfectly preserved here. And here is basically a world premiere. Nobody's ever talked about this for the Albuquerque volcanoes. This is what the surface of the Albuquerque volcanoes lava flows looked like right after they erupted. And this little guy up here is taking advantage of the nice, dark, rough surface to bask in the sun. And you can see that it's consisting of a lot of little strange knobs, and rubble, and debris, but it's not quite as scoriaceous looking as the stuff that we saw there on the base. So this gives you an idea that the surface of the Albuquerque volcanoes lava flows were not these nice, glassy, fluid-looking boy-hoy type lava flows. They were boy-hoy, but it's a particular type, rubbleized boy-hoy, where these blobs and knobs were actually originally more or less plastic pieces of the developing crust that were disturbed because these flows were flowing down a channel and everything was being broken up and then jumbled and dumped in on top of the flow, and now they're solidified in place. And if you want to see one up close, here's one. You can actually see the outline of the flow, or of the rock here. And it's basically just sitting there frozen in place. And the block originally had some sort of vesicle trains that went like this. Probably it was part of a previous crust that got broken up and then got enshrouded in later lava.
So there's always a question about Rinconada Canyon, other places along the escarpment where the flow comes and goes. It appears that you're looking at flow lobes, flow units that went around some kind of an obstruction, probably a high elevation mound of some kind in the middle here of softer material that has since eroded away. This canyon was not carved by the water, not carved by the Rio Grande, which didn't make it all the way here. And in fact, underneath the lava flows, if you look at the edge again, it's a very thin lava flow, really. It's not massive.
Yeah, it's probably 10 feet thick most.
At the most. So underneath that flow is what's called the Santa Fe Formation for geologists.
And it's covered by all the rocks coming off that 10-foot thick layer, making, just coating the slope.
Right. So it's actually a very soft fill to the basin of the Rio Grande Rift underneath this volcanism. And as in many mesas in New Mexico, the basalt is capping the mesa, protecting the underlying rocks from erosion. So eventually the walls will erode back a little bit here and there. But the second question here is, what is all this sand doing here? This is kind of a cool story.
It's even got wind ripples in it. So
yeah,
it's wind-blown sand.
Beautiful. It's wind-blown sand, aeolian deposition, as geologists say, and it appears to be banked up against the edges of the walls of the canyon. And in most cases, you can actually see it coming over the edges, coming from above and depositing up against this slope. What we think this is actually sand that's being derived from the erosion of Jurassic and Cretaceous age sandstone far to the west. The Rio Puerto Valley is filled with Jurassic and Cretaceous sandstones. Those sandstones were originally formed by sand being windblown, deposited, lithified, hardened into rock. Now that rock is breaking down and making sand, windblown sand, and sand dunes all over again.
Okay, here's something to think about. So here's the margin of Rinconada Point, and that little cap of basalt up there, it's about 10 feet thick. It represents the margins of the lava flow that are exposed after the valley walls, which I'm standing in, were totally eroded away and actually inverted. Now it's a valley itself. So the lava flow flowed down a valley, and so there it is, the margin. And the point is that it's, you know, it's not uniform. It's not like this one uniform sheet of basalt, but it actually has, you know, kind of gets big in places and kind of narrow and thin in places. And then right here, as a matter of fact, center of the screen, there's a lot of cinder and scoria coming out and stuff. So keep that in mind, because what we're going to do is we're going to jump up in the air now and look down on what this flow may have looked like when it was actually erupting. And you'll see that it's kind of similar to that Hawaiian lava flow that we saw before. And now we're just simply cutting across the cross section of the lava channel that formed during the emplacement of the lava flow. And so that accounts for some of the differences we're seeing. So we'll look at some of those in a second.
And what Larry was talking about, valleys eroding away, probably these lava channels were following valleys or arroyos that were in the original topography 200,000 years ago when they were erupting. Since then, of course, everything around them has eroded more, and so they're left behind as freestanding ridges.
Yeah, so it's called inverted topography. Okay, as you saw, we just did a long death march down along the edge of the lava flow here in the valley. And there's the edge of the mesa. And look at this. Suddenly we've got all these great big blocks coming down the side of the mesa. They're kind of like in a line coming down the side. So what is that? Well, they're big and they're massive. And as we'll see in a second, there's some really cool stuff going on in them. So what we think is going on here is that, remember that the lava flow is formed by these beautiful lava channels flowing down a slope, and they have like these margins, and then the center is this beautiful flowing red hot lava that when it cools forms massive basalt. And so what we think might be going on here is that these blocks were formerly inside of a channel before the mesa started eroding back. And so they've been sort of let down and tumbled as the erosion took place. So we're going to walk over here and actually look at one of these and so to see if we can confirm that idea that this was a lava channel. It's a beautiful block, big and massive. Oh, you can already see sort of banding in the side, but wait till you see what's up on top here. Anybody want to guess what that is? I mean, look at it. It's totally different. Okay, so here we are on top of that rock we were just looking at, and immediately you can see all sorts of lava textures. There's kind of like knobs that are like stuck in the flow. So these were solidified in place at the time that the flow was cooling. And so what we are doing here is looking at the surface of the Albuquerque volcano's lava flows 200,000 years ago. And you thought you could only go out to Aubele and do that. You can do it right here, 10 minutes from downtown. It's the surface of a lava flow. Not just any lava flow, it's the lava channel like the ones that are occurring in Hawaii today. Right here.
Okay, so we've looked at a lot of the basalt flow and some of the individual rocks. So time for a pop quiz. Take a look at this surface. What do you think? Is this the top of the flow or the bottom of the flow?
Yeah, let me move around here to give you a little bit of 3D from motion sort of thing. And
so how many said top? How many said bottom? And now, drum roll, the answer.
This is the top of the Albuquerque volcano's lava flow. And probably, again, the middle of one of those lava channels. And all those little pieces are, if you look at them closely, they're like scoria, like you would see up there at the volcanoes themselves. So what the heck are they doing way down here, you know, like 3 miles away from the volcano and stuck in the top of the lava flow. Well, you can remember these lava flows are like beautiful channels with these beautiful thin crusts that are floating on the channel. Those basically move away from the vent, and the vent of course is spewing out all this cinder. So one of the places might be picking this up is material from the actual vent is landing on it and being conveyor belted out here. But then every now and then you get a big block like that too, which could have been, you know, broken off the side of the lava channel and fallen onto the top of the lava stream. So anyway, they tend to be kind of really pretty knobby in places, but other places have got some other cool things going on we'll look at in a second. Every rock has a story, and so here's one just sitting beside the trail here. This is again the surface of the lava flow, and of course you can tell because it's got this nice, you know, texture. It's not a nice broken piece. This is an original face or surface in this case of the lava flow. But in this case, instead of having all those little knobs and things, it's got like these grooves and bands and slabs. And so what is that? Well, go back to our picture of the flowing lava coming down the channel, and it has this crust on it that's semi-plastic, semi-brittle. And what happens is when the flow comes down to a point and it starts getting jammed up, that surface crust turns into a series of broken plates that then start, you know, stacking against each other, in this case in this direction. And so you get them all upturned, and in some places they're still flexible because they're still plastic, and so you'll get them kind of contorted. And then there can be something else that was already floating in the lava that gets stuck in there. So this is just, you know, classic surface of the Albuquerque volcanoes. Basically a rubbleized bohoi hoi. There's another thing here that's really common. If you look at a lot of these rocks, there's a lot of this white stuff.
So what is that white stuff? That's a question we get asked all the time. And of course that's also a secondary coating, and it's caliche, calcium carbonate. Geologists believe it comes from the groundwater, so water percolating up through the ground from underneath and depositing that material, coating the rocks. It is a little suspicious though, because it seems to occur in a lot of basaltic areas.
So anyway, literally as we've been moving along the trail here, every rock has a story. So, and volcanic rocks have lots of stories. So what you need is a volcanologist in the museum.
This is a great example of a rock with many stories to tell. So of course it's part of the lava flow field, 200,000 years old. And as the mesa formed through erosion, it was kind of let down to this position. At some point, after it was in this position, it actually split in half, probably due to freeze-thaw cycles. It is a complete lava flow section. The top is on the right, bottom is on the left, and it probably split along one of those foliation zones Larry was talking about. Subsequently, desert varnish formed onto all of the exposed surfaces, and you can really see a good example here. This dark, glossy desert varnish versus the color of the underlying rock. So desert varnish is chemical weathering. It is believed to be caused by intermittent water in a semi-arid or arid environment with an organic component.
So it's kind of like powder coating. It's basically the dust gets on there, then you wet it with rain, and then so that affixes the dust to the surface. But of course in powder coating, it's the dust gets melted onto it, but it's the same thing. This is water-based painting, I guess.
And of course, within the last 1,000 years, the ancestral Puebloan people took advantage of the desert varnish coating to chip through it to produce their beautiful rock art. That is one of the classic petroglyphs, the humpback flute player. But above it is something really unique. It's a spiral on two sides of the rock, so it almost looks three-dimensional. specific level below the lava flows, we find this area that is just full of cobbles, all different kinds, all different sizes. They must have been deposited from a river system coming through here. Some of them are really big, so we're talking about a big river, a raging river. And not only that, but they're all different types. There's gneisses and granites and quartzites. They're coming from the west. Where are they coming from? This could have been an ancestral Rio Puerco, some of the ancestral rivers coming from the west that came into the basin as it started to develop before the Rio Grande began to develop. And of course, long before this lava flow erupted. And to finish off, we want to show you one of our favorite petroglyphs. We refer to this as the winged cat.
Yeah, but to really finish off, let's look at the beautiful basalt there. Look at that. Look at those beautiful vesicles there. Oh yeah, look here, so a fresh surface. You can see the plagioclase. Yep. Every rock has a story.
So olivine, plagioclase, lath-shaped crystals.
Yep.
It's beautiful.
Yep. All sorts of stories. Every rock has one.
So the amazing thing about Petroglyph National Monument, right here along the trail, we actually have an area that was probably an ancestral Puebloan campsite. And look at the use that they have made of this basalt boulder. These are definitely metate areas for corn grinding, and we're right near those big cobbles. Look at this, probably used, or similar rocks to this were probably used as monos.
Does it fit in one of these? Yeah, look at that. So you just put your corn in there and grind away. And look at the rock, it's kind of bluish there where all the desert varnish has been removed. Indication that it's not in a natural state. Every rock has a story.
Thanks for joining us on our virtual field trip.
And did I mention that every rock has a story?
I think you did.
Really?
Yeah.